Moderating the discussion will be Bart Gellman, who is from the grade class of '82. He is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, author. He's a visiting specialist here at the school. Many of you know Bart from previous talks. So we're so pleased that you're all here on this rainy day. We will have a book sale and signing afterwards in the Bernstein Gallery right outside the door, so I hope that you will stay around for that. Thank you. Bart?
Welcome, everybody. I think we're going to start off with a few slides from Helen, and we'll take it from there.
Great. Over here. So we wanted to kind of show you the essence of the book in just a few slides to give you an idea of kind of what we were doing. So let me just say that the book is about presidential power and foreign policy. I think many people think the president is very, very powerful, but we think the president's perspective may be more like this. That on any day, history kind of runs away with him with a kind of wild animal underneath him, and that he's not all that much in control of anything that's going on. And we're going to talk more about the situation, conditions under which he is, and seems to be more in control of things, and those he seems to be less in control of things. We also noticed that this is going to be a lot about domestic politics, and presidents, while they're focused on foreign policy, have to worry a lot about domestic politics, as this cartoon might suggest to you. Even in this area of immigration policy, he's got a lot of domestic politics going on. If you combine our interest in presidential power over foreign policy and the problem of domestic politics, and then you look at kind of all the different instruments that the president has in foreign policy, you come to this slide, which really does encapsulate many of the ideas that we are going to talk about, which is that the president has a lot of these different tools that he can use: immigration policy, trade policy, foreign aid policy, environmental policy. And on many of these, he has lots and lots of domestic politics going on, and he's got Congress constantly sort of challenging him. But then when he pulls out the military instrument, everybody is gung-ho and we're off to the races. This is sort of the crux of the argument here is why is this occurring? And does this, in a sense, portend the militarization of American foreign policy, which we, in the book, talk a little bit about. But basically, we're trying to show that there is this kind of difference among these policy tools that the president faces and how his power varies from instrument to instrument. So I will leave it there, and I guess we will turn to Bart talking about asking us some questions and having a bit of a discussion.
Yeah, I have the easy part. I get to pose the question. When I read through your work, it occurred to me that all this sort of roiling domestic politics was a little bit out of sync with this pastoral-sounding title about sailing the water's edge. It seemed like it should be a tsunami or something. But this model of vigorous domestic debate and constraint differs from other traditional models of foreign policy. Talk about how that is.
Yeah, so I should say that the title of the book, Sailing the Water's Edge, comes from this very famous phrase that was coined many years ago that basically said politics stops at the water's edge. And this phrase was used to indicate that once it came to foreign policy, which was things beyond the water's edge, domestic politics wouldn't matter anymore, and presidents would have control, they could do things, and everybody would be sort of behind them because we were all sort of serving the national interest. And our book is really about, well, that's not exactly the case, because right on that water's edge, there are a lot of policies and a lot of things going on, and politics tends to spill over and get, as the book sort of indicates, the front of the book kind of, messes with all the water. The way it differs is that a lot of books on foreign policy do one of two things. First, they either look at the international side, and they take a very realist account of things, and they say, well, U.S. policy is this way because the Soviets are doing this, or the Chinese are doing this, and the U.S. has to respond by balancing or bandwagoning. And they take a very kind of international approach to things. There's a second sort of strand of American foreign policy that is very personalistic. And it's all about Obama versus Bush versus Clinton, and it's very much about personalities, and the argument there is often, well, every president differs, and they differ in all these ways because of their personalities and their beliefs and all of these types of things. And our book goes through the middle of those ways and sort of says, no, it's much more about American political institutions, which are very stable and have been for many years. And it's any president faces these things, and they face them no matter what the external world is doing. They still have to deal with these domestic political institutions that have been sort of long-standing. And so that's the way in which the book kind of goes through the middle, I think, of these different traditions.
Well, in both senses, though, you're contesting the idea of a unitary U.S. foreign policy.
Very much so.
So Douglas, one of the things that you do in the book is you talk about policy substitution and policy complements. Talk about what work that does for your argument.
Right. So I think to start with, we wanted to really push the idea that American foreign policy is comprised of a number of instruments: trade policy, immigration, the use of sanctions, the deployment of military troops, economic development aid, military aid, etc. And that, a lot of the earlier work had really sort of isolated each of those at a time. You'd get a big book about trade policy, and it would tell you everything you really need to know about trade policy, but wouldn't talk about anything else. You'd get a big book about immigration, and would talk a lot about immigration, but not really talk about how it relates to anything else. And you got some work that was about economic development aid that would just talk about that. But the reality is that if you're a leader and you're sitting trying to figure out how to best approach a particular situation, you want to think about, well, how are some of these tools able to be used either together, or when and where is one more appropriate than another, right? So that's an idea of something that's either complementary, two tools kind of go together and reinforce each other, or perhaps a substitute, right? One versus the other. There's an old adage in the not that old, but in the early 90s, that was all about trade, not aid, and it was all about how we should be engaging with Haiti at the time. And it was very much seen as using one tool versus another. But where we found it particularly interesting to kind of unpack was this idea that, well, maybe the president is more constrained in being able to use and substitute towards some set of tools versus another, right? And this is this idea, as Helen was pointing out, that the president might sit down with their team and diagnose a situation and suggest, hey, what we really need a solid combination of trade incentives for this country and some pressure with some sanctions and maybe even put some soldiers on the ground. But the problem is that using tools like trade then run into significant domestic opposition. So one of the examples that we talk about in the book for a little bit is Pakistan in the post-2000, post-9/11 era, where we were thinking, okay, we've got some bad people over there that we need to go after. But Pakistan is a very complicated social and economic system. And so at first there was actually some solid efforts to try to say to the Pakistani government, hey, let's put in place some items that will help you trade more with the United States. A lot of this was around textiles. And that worked for about a year until constituencies in Congress who came from the remaining districts that still produce textiles in the United States started to raise a fuss over that. And as a result, you saw policy towards Pakistan being increasingly focused on the use of military tools, right? And so the desire then to be able to substitute towards using something like trade policy as one component of an overall package was really shut out, and it was shut out due to domestic politics coming from Congress.
So I take it that you do not accept another traditional claim, which is that presidents are highly constrained in domestic policy, but generally free to do as they like overseas.
Yeah, so that was kind of what started us out on this whole project. Was this is a very well-known kind of argument. It's presidency is domestic politics, where, you know, he's constantly fighting with Congress and interest groups and things like this. And the second presidency is foreign policy, where supposedly he's free to do much more of what he wants. And we just looked at this and said, you know, this just isn't true in a lot of foreign policy areas. When the president wants to use trade policy or to sign a trade agreement or reduce tariffs on other countries, when the president wants to give economic aid to other countries, when the president wants to change immigration policy to help another country, he is not at all free to do these things. Congress, interest groups, and the public intervene often very, very substantially in these areas, just as they do in education policy or in you know, health policy. There can be a lot of opposition and a lot of difficulty for the president to do these things. And this makes a lot of areas of foreign policy, not all of them, very much like the rest of domestic politics. And so we didn't think this vision of the two presidencies carried much weight.
In some sense, we could think about this as being there existing, you know, more of the three presidencies, right? That you have something that is just straight domestic, bread and butter type policy, then policies like trade and economic aid that share many of the same characteristics to some of those policies, but have a little flavor of being, you know, they're still oriented towards dealing with a foreign relations situation. But then certainly at the extreme, we acknowledge that part of the perspective, as Helen was pointing to, that when it comes to control over intelligence gathering, which you obviously have a substantial background and understanding, as well as the deployment of military troops, there we start to see the more sort of traditional role of the president.
So among the wide range of tools available for foreign policy, are there certain kinds of tools that in which the president is more consistently constrained and others in which more consistently the president is free?
Yeah. So I would say that certainly comes to trade politics, we've seen this time and time again. The Trans-Pacific Partnership is just the latest example of this. Economic development aid is an area where the president's been highly constrained. For example, we just today appointed the new administrator for USAID, which is our main economic aid agency, a woman, an extremely talented by all accounts, woman named Gail Smith. But that was a post that the president couldn't get his person passed and put in place for months due to partisan and other wrangling in Congress. And so those are certainly areas where you see a substantial amount of constraints. And these constraints take the form of not putting people passing people to put people in administrative positions, but also all sorts of regulations that Congress, reporting requirements, et cetera, that would be in place. And so that's a set of areas then where the president is highly constrained. And those are important tools, right? Those are important tools of American foreign policy that then the president is much more limited in their ability. I should also say that this is something that cuts across partisan lines as well. Under the George W. Bush administration, there was a lot of interest, for example, in a development model known as the Millennium Challenge Account, Millennium Challenge Corporation. This was a sort of a different way to approach economic development aid. And even George W. Bush saw his ability to put in place those sorts of ideas and that development agenda severely constrained by Congress. So this is not something that we're arguing necessarily just pertains to a Democratic president, but this is something that is much more structural and institutional in quality.
You've got a table in the book that describes two main axes of constraint, if I'm reading it correctly, which are ideological and distributional. Why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So I was just putting up, this is, again, this presidential power by issue area. So those are the different kind of tools that we've been talking about, domestic military spending, economic aid, trade, immigration, sanctions, geopolitical aid, military intervention. And again, we think presidential power is going to be sort of highest in the areas at the top there, the military intervention and geopolitical aid. And again, our argument for why this is the case is that in these areas, there are often two things that are missing, and that's why the president has a lot of influence.
Let's talk about one thing. What are the measurements that you're using for this?
So this is just theoretically driven. We then go through a lot of different chapters where we look at interest groups, we look at Congress, we look at budgets, we look at bureaucracies, and we try and show presidential power in each of those different arenas on these different issues. And we try and see if, in a sense, the presidential power and the different issues in these different arenas matches kind of this theoretical graph. And that's what the rest of the interior of the book is really an attempt to show this is kind of what the world looks like in all these different arenas for the president. And so why you get this graph and this projection this way is that in certain areas you have enormous amounts of what we call distributive politics. That is, these policies have an effect on Americans and interest groups in America and businesses in America and NGOs in America, and they may not like those effects, or they may really like those effects, and they have therefore a say in whether the president can actually adopt a policy that has that effect. So as Dustin was talking about with Pakistan, the Pakistani government after 9/11 really wanted a trade agreement with the United States. But that trade agreement was going to have distributive effects. It was going to have costs and benefits that were distributed differently across people in the United States. And certain groups, as Dustin mentioned, these textile manufacturers, did not like the effects of this. They lobbied their congresspeople very heavily, and their congresspeople basically vetoed the bill that the president wanted at the time to allow a trade agreement with Pakistan so that Pakistan would help us in dealing with Al-Qaeda. And the same thing in the area of aid, where we also, the Pakistanis wanted a lot more economic aid. We tried to give it to them, but there it was less a distributive politics kind of story of interest groups kind of pushing against it than an ideological one where many Republicans say, you know, we just don't like economic aid and ideologically we're opposed to this, and so you, the president, are not going to be able to do this. And so when the president faces really strong ideological divisions among the parties, and or when he faces really strong distributive politics, like in the trade example with interest groups, he's very constrained, and that sort of puts him in the lower part of this graph here. On the other hand, when he's talking about geopolitical aid or military intervention, there's often, at least before it's undertaken, there's often a lot less ideological contestation over these things, because the president can say, this is in the national interest, we're doing this in the national interest, and there's less distributive politics often associated with it because there are fewer interest groups that are affected in some ways by the mobilization of our all-volunteer military. And so this, in a sense, frees the president from a lot of these constraints. And in another area that you know well about, this also means the president has an informational advantage. In areas where there are lots of interest groups involved and their sort of, you know, bacon is being affected, they're going to transmit, they know lots and lots about the trade agreement and its effects and the economic aid and its effects, and they can translate that information to Congress. When it's a military issue, like, you know, what is it going to be like to introduce 500 special ops forces into northern Syria, there aren't a lot of domestic actors that know a lot more about that than the president does, and the Department of Defense that works for the president. And so in those areas, the president has a lot more informational advantages that can be used to get what he wants.
Right, well, in those areas, he knows more, but also he can constrict the flow of information to the other actors, and so they don't actually know quite exactly what they're debating on.
Yeah.
So I remember in Pakistan after 9/11, there were lots of conflicting desires and objectives of U.S. policy. There were lots of proposed instruments. I understand why a trade agreement or a textiles agreement can bore various oxes here and have these distributional effects. Why wasn't the U.S. able to use instruments like aid to education in schools for counter-radicalization? I mean, leaving the field to, you know, the Wahhabists who were, you know, giving away their services and running most of the Pakistani schools.
I mean, again, Congress in this period, at least up until about 2003, was, especially the Republicans, were just very negative on foreign aid. And they vetoed most bills, they cut back foreign aid. If you look at the U.S. foreign aid budget, especially during the Clinton period in the 90s, I think 1997 is kind of the low point of U.S. foreign aid in sort of constant dollar terms for for decades. It was really a striking sort of cutback, because at that point the Republicans were very, very strongly against the use of foreign aid in any kind of context. They were much more happy with military aid, that is, giving other countries weapons or helping their military forces, but they were not interested in things like aid for schools in Pakistan and things like that.
So I'm going to go through even further into a tour of the cliches about foreign policy here. One of the other things you often hear is that external threat, external crisis, rallies everyone around the flag, rallies them around the president, and unites the country. Did you find that to be the case?
So we didn't look as much into that as part of this project, and I think there's certainly something to that, but I think in some ways our theory captures elements of that intuition insofar as this external threat is something that is going to threaten, by definition, all Americans, and so you don't see particular congresspersons saying, oh, you know what, this threat is more salient for me than it is for you, and so I want it more versus less, et cetera. And that's very similar to how we think about this distributional consequence component, where some districts might gain from an agreement and some districts might lose. With a common external threat, you don't quite get that same dynamic, and so it could potentially set up the grounds for this sort of rally around the flag type phenomenon. I mean, certainly following 9/11, the votes that Congress took were basically the congressperson from Berkeley, California, was the only person that was really actively voting against some of these things, and that's certainly an outlier in that respect. So I think there's a potential for that. I think that same dynamic is something that we as a society should be cautious and reflective about, because it has the potential to shape and constrain the types of foreign policy responses that we end up using, right? So obviously ISIS is on everyone's mind. The tragedy in Paris is shocking and deplorable, and the discourse around that is largely around, okay, well, what's the military card to play here? And I think certainly Helen and I would agree on this. The military card is one that these are some pretty wicked people that giving them some extra education and some food aid isn't going to be exactly what they're wanting to have a conversation about. But at the same time, what's the long-term plan? What's the long-term plan in Syria? What was the long-term plan in Iraq? What is the long-term plan in Afghanistan? And if some of these tools like trade and economic aid are somehow taken off of the table because we're just freaked out about this external security threat, then that's kind of concerning. Right? There needs to be a much more synthetic approach to shaping these policy responses. So these external threats, have a tendency to generate these rally around the flag type phenomena. But I think we as a society should be cautious about what that then enables certain leaders to do, including the president.
We could, I mean, if you feel prepared to talk about this, we could bring this conversation right up to date, right up to the minute, if we were to apply your ideas to climate change and the climate change meetings going on right now. How do you analyze the president's sort of choices and options and ability to carry out an optimal policy mix, given the models you've been writing about?
Well, I mean, I think in some ways it fits very well with our model, because climate change has very large distributional consequences. Trying to mitigate climate change will have very large climate change itself will have large distributional consequences, but trying to mitigate it will also have large distributional consequences. And I think that's why there are very, very powerful groups, led often by energy firms, that are opposed to doing anything about it. And I think they have mobilized good segments of Congress to oppose anything, and that's why the president is being, in a sense, forced in Paris not to go for a treaty, where other countries as well as the United States are constrained in a sense by a treaty agreement. And and to do this as kind of, some executive agreement that doesn't so far need congressional approval. But I think that will have long-term consequences in terms of compliance with the agreement. And again, if the Republican contenders for president say they're going to reverse this if it's ever signed and they get into power. So it's it fits in this story very much, domestic politics being a very central element of foreign policy because of distributional and ideological concerns. I think there are some Americans who may not be all that negatively affected by it, by climate change, who are just ideologically opposed to the idea that this is occurring and that we should do something about it.
I think it'll be really interesting to see how, in the aftermath of the Paris climate talks, discourse proceeds about climate change in light of these considerations that Helen was just talking about. So for example, the U.S. military is really scared of climate change. They have come out and time again said, we're really scared about this, A. B, it's going to cost us a lot more to do business around the world with this stuff going on, unpredictability, and simple mechanical things. Their ships weren't built for the conditions that they'll subsequently have to be in, et cetera. And certainly some of Obama's remarks are along the lines of saying climate change is a security issue. And so it'll be interesting to see, in some senses, how the rhetoric plays out here, right? Can the Obama administration transform the discourse and the rhetoric around climate change to be one that de-emphasizes all of these distributional type considerations and emphasizes some of these more national level security type considerations? They're trying to do that. It'll be interesting to see. How effective. It'll also be interesting to see whether the Obama administration or subsequent administrations, if they choose to, start to think about ways to compensate the losers to climate change reform. So we have something called trade adjustment assistance, the TAA. This has not been a positive thing in some political circles, but the whole idea is that maybe we can make more amenable trade liberalization by helping workers to retrain, et cetera. There's an open, idea out there. Should there be something equivalent of climate adjustment assistance? Okay. So I think it'll be very interesting to see how.
If you get thrown out of your job in the coal
Yeah,
mines.
no, exactly. I think my pops is from West Virginia, and I go back on occasion, and those folks aren't looking at a rosy set of circumstances once coal is finally dead there. Kentucky as well, Kentucky especially, Ohio, et cetera. So it'll be interesting to see if the administration can both pivot the sort of rhetorical debate about climate change to have this more national level security type implication. Certainly the climate scientists in the military are suggesting it to be so. Whether it can resonate with the public is less clear. As well as maybe try to use some of these economic tools that in the past have been tried to be used to mollify some of these distributional concerns.
Right. Well, look, it's traditional for decades now to militarize the rhetoric in some cases in war on drugs, or Eisenhower calling the national highway system a national security issue. But you can't have a war on carbon. I mean, your book talks about constraining the president and funneling him toward a militarized response, but that's not what's going on here in the climate change debate, is it?
Well, the consequences of climate change could portend a number of security considerations. Not directly, Mr. CO2 isn't the one that's going to be, him or herself is going to be the one that's putting, massive flows of refugees and immigrants out into the ocean. But the ultimate effects of some of these things could be extremely destabilizing. And you have to think about, you already have a number of regimes around the world that aren't extremely stable, where massive hits of poverty and disease could be extremely destabilizing. And so,
right. I mean, the Navy likes to have its ports above water. But I'm talking about policy tools now. So I mean,
right.
what are some constituents of an ideal policy mix if you were to address climate change? You talked about adjustment assistance, but what other ones is the president sort of barred from employing, or is it hard for him to employ?
I mean, one of the things that's been talked about is using trade agreements and using the WTO as a way to kind of enforce a carbon tax. What industry has been afraid of is that if you impose a carbon tax that's very high in one country, that gives other countries who don't impose that an advantage in exporting their goods to around the world and to that country. And so some people have talked about using the WTO as a mechanism to basically impose a carbon tax and then allow people to use tariffs if other countries don't impose the same level of carbon tax. Right. That, I think, is another tool the president could possibly use. And then there's this, again, giving aid, not just adjustment assistance, but there's, from the earlier agreements on climate change, there is giving economic aid to developing countries to change their technologies and to diffuse technology much faster so that they can kind of get up to speed on all the climate mitigating technologies.
There's also a slightly different version of some of that, which is thinking more about the United States as being an extremely important consumer market. So this is the sort of California effect, where the idea here is that California has a number of much more stringent regulations. To sell a car in California, it has to meet a different level of regulations that California has put in place. And because of the size of the California market, if you're a manufacturer, you're thinking, well, heck, if I'm going to try to produce something for this broad set of markets, and one of those markets is California that has a lot of people that want to buy this product, then you start to think, well, maybe I should just make this product such that it meets the California requirements, which ends up meaning that it does better than the requirements in a number of other areas. However, the way that our system is set up for some of these things is that that's a state level decision, and that could be for good reasons, but that does have the consequence of putting more onus on the president to be able to amp up some of these regulatory things. But by amping up some of those regulatory dynamics, that could have spillover effects throughout the rest of the world marketplace that could actually be positive when it comes to climate change. However, the ability of the Obama administration to improve different things like fuel requirements has been very challenging, and that's going to end up in the courts.
I have a few more questions, but I want to just alert all the rest of you that I'm going to widen the conversation soon. And you know that thing where nobody has a question for the first 2 minutes and then everybody has a question. Why don't you start thinking of your question now while I ask a few more. One might be, let's find an optimistic note here. What episode or event can you point to in which foreign policy was done right from the perspective of your book, when the president was able to use the full range of policy instruments, and what brought that about, how that happened?
So this might be a little contentious, but I've been kind of inspired by the handling of both Ukraine and Myanmar. Okay, so let's take Ukraine. There was certainly an option on the table to go, in the language of Dr. Strangelove, toe-to-toe with the Ruskies. Probably good we didn't, although I'm not a security expert of that level. But what did you see? You saw the, I think, relatively effective use of both sanctions, something that the president has more control over, the ability to target, etc. They have been debilitating against certain actors in Russia. But you also saw Congress get in behind some substantial aid support for Ukraine in this. Now, has that been perfect? Has it gone like everyone wants? Probably not. But I guess I would point to that as being an example of effectively combining different types of policy instruments, both sort of a good cop and bad cop type of thing, and having a reasonable effect.
So So it imposed costs on Russia, but it didn't change the borders.
Yeah, but we always
didn't
have-
do much for Crimea.
Yeah, it didn't do much for Crimea, and I think most would say that that was a little bit of a lost cause. But you could imagine a different world where Ukraine's losses to Russia, or excuse me, those who sympathize with Russia could have been substantially more. In some sense, we never know that counterfactual. And my assertion is that were the United States not to have used those combination of tools, that the situation from the Ukrainian perspective, which is an important part, an important ally of the United States, could have been a lot worse.
You have another example in mind, by chance?
Yeah, so Dustin is talking more recent, and I guess I would go back to the end of World War II, and I think there was a very good sort of set of responses where you had an integrated program that combined vast amounts of Marshall Plan aid for Europe, which was devastated at the time. It combined that with trying to stabilize the international economy through the Bretton Woods system in the monetary area and the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade in the trade area, as well as with NATO and some other alliances in other parts of the world. And I think that kind of combination of economic aid, of trade policy, of alliance policy in the military area, plus our troops in Europe. I mean, I think that had a very powerful effect in stabilizing Western Europe and preventing, I guess, the fall of Western Europe to communism, which we did not want to have occur, and any kind of a Soviet invasion. So I think historically that was a very powerful one. And I kind of wish we could think about that example. So we're supposedly having a global war on terror, and we're using a lot of military, and probably in my mind not enough of the trade, the economic aid, even immigration policy and other types of policies to supplement the military side. And I think it's partly a lot due to domestic politics in the United States, but if you could use all of those things and package things so that you were helping countries in areas that are sort of fraught with danger, and one of the countries I know better is Tunisia, and as people here probably know, Tunisia's had three terrorist strikes in the last year about, and they're struggling. They came through the Arab Spring. They're the only country that came through the Arab Spring that threw off the dictatorship and now have a semi-democratic kind of system. They really need, they really need our help in terms of their economy to stabilize as democracy, and giving them aid, signing trade agreements with them, doing a whole bunch of things that would help them out, us and the Europeans, I think would be one way of stabilizing and helping Tunisia. Tunisia, as you may know, is also a main conduit for many ISIS converts. And so, again, by helping the Tunisian economy, you might actually sort of be reducing pressures on from ISIS.
You talked about the Marshall Plan, the post-war period. It's a little unfair because your book doesn't really delve into it, but if you feel comfortable, could you fast forward that to George H.W. Bush and the reunification of Germany and sort of the fall of 17? Was there roughly a comparable mix of tools used? Was it equally effective?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a nice analogy. I mean, I think that administration was a little slow to realize that the wall was falling and the Cold War was over. But in a sense, when they did, and then into the Clinton administration, they started the European Bank for redevelopment and all of these things, and there was a combination of debt forgiveness, of aid, of bringing them into the European Union so that you had the trade component, and then bringing them into the WTO, I think there was a very sort of good combination of different policies.
But what was the recipe that allowed that to work? I mean, how did that work then, and the same sort of approach was not available to other presidents?
Well, I think the Europeans took the lead, is the thing, with Eastern Europe. I don't know if Dustin agrees.
Yeah, I think that's right.
I mean, I think the Europeans are seen, if you sort of said, is our book sort of relevant to any other country? A lot of countries, most countries have different political institutions than the United States. They're often parliamentary systems, and the European Union operates very, very differently than the United States. But Europe generally has been more interested in using trade agreements and accession to the European Union and all of its different laws and open borders and things like this as a draw for bringing in countries, and it's also offered aid and things like this. So I think that the EU has been slightly different, but I think that they were a major sort of force in moving forward in that period after the Cold War.
You've alluded to it already. What would a balanced approach look like in response to the attacks by ISIS in Paris and elsewhere?
So I think,
I mean, and is there? I mean, do the politics of U.S. foreign policy allow that?
right. It's a tough question. I think that part of it will be certainly thinking through what are the military options, what are the safest military options for our service members, what are effective opportunities for encouraging development in particular regions in Syria and elsewhere that are more secure, right? So there are certain, while maybe some have this view of basically Syria and Iraq have completely disintegrated, that's just not the case, right? And so how can you build up buffer societies and buffer institutions in these areas of the world such that the free flowing ability that ISIS seems to have now becomes more limited. That said, I think, and this is certainly where a huge challenge will be is, the Assad regime is it's making it pretty difficult, right? So, is it feasible to be encouraging development in some of these areas of Syria that are also in open revolt against the Assad regime, and then the Russians have come in and all that. So that's if I had solutions to that one, we'd be further south in D.C.
I mean, again, I think sanctions that stop the flow of money, anything that stops the flow of people into ISIS, right? And maybe that is, in the longer run, more development in some of these areas, and certainly trying to stabilize parts of Iraq where I think some people, where ISIS is and it's coming from, and help development in those areas. I mean, again, the story is that when the U.S. and the Iraqi government poured lots of money into those Sunni areas, things calmed down after, in the late 2000s, right? And that was what sort of allowed Iraq to stabilize for a period of time. It was when all of that got cut off, the Americans left, the aid got cut off, and the Iraqi government cut off the aid, that the whole kind of western side of Iraq went ISIS.
Yeah. Just to, on the, close to sanctions, but not quite sanctions, I think the U.S. can be doing clearly a better job at putting pressure on the Iraqi regime to be treating its population in a less sectarian way. That's something where, we want to be able to have that leverage, and it's not clear to me that the United States has used that leverage quite as much as it could have. And so, a lot of the frustration in Iraq is a function of the Iraqi regime being very personalistic, very partisan, that you don't get military jobs unless you belong to this sector, that. That's not a way to build up a broad-based coalition against terror. And I think the United States could up the pressure that it's putting on the Iraqi regime in order to put that in place.
So there's the pressure and sanctions and cutting off of funding and oxygen to bad actors, and then there are the building up parts that you talked about, and that idea, that this idea of nation building started to get a bad name in American politics in the administration. What was the reason for that backlash, and were there good reasons for it?
I mean, there's Lebanon where the troops get blown up, and there's Somalia where we don't do very well, and you know, I think that those incidents, in some ways poison things. But again, I mean, I think it's telling that in response to the Ebola crisis in West Africa, what could the United States do? At the end of the day, it could send some aid and it sent the military in. And that was our only tool of capability to deal with an epidemic. Now, I mean, one of the things that Dustin and I suggest at the end of the book is maybe what we need is some kind of civilian corps that is like that is trained like the military. So it's not the Peace Corps where people come in and they have their skills they already have and they go and do things. It would be a corps that really had skills in engineering and, you know, democracy building and a whole series of things where you could then maybe deploy that corps to areas where you have a tsunami hit rather than having the American military arrive, or where you have Ebola hit and you have the American military arrive, or where you have, you know, some bad climate change problem hit, and you know, the only thing we're going to have is the American military. So you need these other kind of nation building things that are not associated with the military, because the military, I mean, we have empirical evidence that when you start putting in American military, especially in certain types of countries that have different cultural traditions, all it does is draw fire. It starts conflicts and it heats those conflicts up, and it makes the people in those regions not want the Americans to be around. And so I think if we had a civilian corps that went in to try and deal with some of these problems, you might have a very different response.
Right, I mean, of course, we don't send military into an earthquake zone because we want to shoot someone. It's, the military is the only institution that has the resources, the airlift, the sea lift, the ability to sort of live in a sparse environment, bring its own logistics. I mean, wouldn't you need a civilian corps that had ships and planes and all that sort of thing if you wanted to?
Yeah, I mean, you might, and I mean, our last slide actually goes to this point. Let me see if I can make this thing work. So this is from 1900 to 2010. This is the Defense Department versus the State Department.
In personnel?
In personnel, not counting the military. This is civilian personnel. This is the State Department.
That's not the zero axis, that's,
Slightly above zero. And this is the Defense Department. We don't have the capabilities to run a kind of civilian nation-building project, and we cut down those capabilities. And you know, this, I think, is kind of exactly this sort of militarization that we're worried about. Because if you can only use the military because of domestic political reasons, and then because you're only putting capabilities into your military, that's the only thing you're going to use. It's like the only thing, if you only have a hammer, you're going to use that for everything. And we want you to have hammers and screwdrivers and, you know, everything, not just hammers.
So get ready, because this is the part where I'm about to go to you. I just want to ask you to speak loudly since we don't have mics, and speak briefly so there's more time for more questions. Please.
I'd be curious to know how you are going to communicate this concept to our elected officials.
Well, they're all going to read the book.
I mean, what about organizing? I mean, what you're talking about is not a dream, but a necessity. And with the conflict, the rigidity of the two parties, when you talked about change, I mean, in the 50s there was cooperation. There was, everybody had been affected by that bad war. But we're basically an isolated country. And
Well,
the
actually,
only way,
Could I just ask you, do you data show that this kind of cooperation was greater in the 50s? So the presidents were less constrained in the 50s?
yeah, so it's interesting, you know, one of the things that we found that in the area of sort of broadly speaking in foreign policy, you have not seen quite as much of the partisanship and ideological cleavages as you've seen in some of other domestic areas, right? So I think you still see it in some areas more than others, and that's certainly something that we're pointing to. But overall, it's not nearly as partisan as something like Obamacare, which, I mean, that's, you say Obamacare and that's just Republican, I mean, it's just, people just can't take out their partisan affiliation and even process Obamacare in that setting. But to go to your first point, you know, I'll put it this way: we have a presidential election coming up, and I've got a lot of energy, you know, I think that you know, part of the reason that we're doing events like this is to be able to get this perspective out to a broader community of people who are influential in their own right, people who are willing to be critical both of the message and the work that we're working on, but also be critical listeners and debaters about what you know, our presidential candidates are saying. I also think that there are you know, opportunities for putting ideas in the minds of our future leaders, like coming again here to somewhere like the Woodrow Wilson School, who are going to be going into government, right? So again, let's take this example of Gail Smith, who is the newly anointed administrator of USAID. Why is that not a cabinet level position? Why is that not a cabinet level position? Why isn't the foremost administrator of such an important tool not a cabinet level position, not in the same room when we're talking about long-term policy in Syria, et cetera? And I think that that's, you know, you have, by all accounts, an extremely talented woman that's in that role. Can we redesign our institutions in a way that reflects that need? So I think those are opportunities for us, and you know, we're up for battle.
There, Lynn. Go ahead, Nancy.
Yeah, just a question about the military itself. You alluded to the volunteer military or mercenary military, depending on how you want to think about it. How does the fact that we have a paid military that's very small and volunteer affect the imbalances that you're talking about? And how would it change things if we had went back to a draft, and we had a much larger national service period, we had a much larger core that would be more flexible in the way that you're saying? We'd also have, we'd have to reach national consensus, so the president would be more constrained in terms of military options, but it would balance the way that he could use various options in a different way.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of agree with this point of view that says if you did have a conscript military, you would probably have more pressure on the president to you know, be accountable for these moves of putting you know, soldiers abroad. I don't think that would really change this dynamic entirely. I think you would still have the president having more capacity to do what he wants in those military areas, because again, he's got these informational advantages, and there still aren't some of the distributive consequences that there are for these other policy areas. So while I think that would change things a bit, I don't think it would completely overturn a lot of what we're seeing now. I don't know if Dustin.
I think that's right.
So,
Was there ever, in fact, a time when politics ended at the water's edge? And if so, when did it change, and what were the factors that caused the change?
Yeah, I mean, our book doesn't go back much further than sort of the immediate post-World War II period, but I think that you could probably look back and see a lot of this. For instance, trade policy throughout the 19th century in the United States was very fraught domestically. It was, every president, you know, from different parties would sort of liberalize and protect things. And so clearly certain areas here, we didn't even have really an aid policy before World War II, so aid wasn't that affected. But I think you probably did see in some of these other areas this type of policy, where the domestic politics was very important. But it's just always been a story that has been told that somehow the president is more free in these areas.
And at some point, I mean, you know, immigration is kind of telling here as well. I mean, this is a country that you know, some say is built on immigrants, right? And the flows of immigration in the 19th century vastly outpaced what they were in the 20th century. And an open question is well, why was it less political then than it is now? I think that's a good question. I'm not sure the assumption underlying it is right. There was lots of politics around immigration in the 19th century, but it was more who are we letting in, right? And what particular groups are we going to decide to demonize in this decade versus the next one? And we're seeing that, now as well. It's just now we've chosen another group to demonize as incoming immigrants. I think that immigration is another area where it was probably regularly politicized, maybe just in different ways and attached to different types of groups that were then the relevant immigrant populations there.
I haven't heard you talk about China. I'm just interested in, that's a whole different animal. It's a country that is soon going to be an equal to the United States, and how that is going to affect the dynamics of foreign policy.
Great, excellent question. So I think, to the extent in the book that we talk directly about China, a lot of it's about the TPP, the trade agreement. And it's interesting to think about the TPP in the context of being a tool that could perhaps help check some degree of Chinese aggression in Southeast Asia. The opposition that Obama has faced around TPP seems sort of unmindful of that in some respects. There are parts of the TPP I like. There's parts that I don't. Right? I'm not a bandwagon, for that. But I think there's, net and given the sort of geopolitical consequences of having in place an agreement like that, I think it might be a smart move. But instead, what have we seen? It's who is it? Senator Orrin Hatch just facilitated Obama getting fast track authority, and then has decided to say, oh no, I want some more things for pharmaceuticals. And then you go and you look, okay, he I think is the #2 recipient of PAC contributions from pharmaceuticals. Well, I mean, come on, that's an old story, but it's a telling story, right? And so I think to the extent that we
It's a sad story.
it's a story, and I study politics, so there's a lot of sadness. So I think to the extent that we engage with China, we need to be thinking about using something like the TPP, and furthermore, depending on Chinese decisions about a number of important issues, I think we should be open to more systematic engagement with China itself on trade. There are different. You led with a number of adages. One adage is the democratic piece. Democracies don't fight other democracies. There's another adage, the capitalist piece. Capitalists don't fight other capitalists. I'm not sure China is. Well, they're not a capitalist country, although there are certainly elements of it. But having a more networked, trade-dependent relationships could be helpful, and we should keep that in mind.
What if we were to apply your model to a comparison of the Trans-Pacific Partnership now and 15, 20 years ago, the North American free trade? I mean, have the domestic politics and constraints of those really differ much? Is there a trend line?
I would argue that you've got a lot of the same politics in the two agreements, and you've got all this distributive politics at the domestic level, parts of which Dustin was just talking about, sort of pushing against doing these agreements that might be very helpful politically and perhaps also to some extent economically. So,
I think one important distinction to note is that Republican support for NAFTA substantially outstripped Republican support for what we're currently seeing, and in part that's just they didn't have. There are a variety of explanations for that, but one is that the Republican Party has become more politically extreme and was super alienated by Obamacare and didn't want to work with him, even though the Republican Party and so, I'd say that's another distinction. I think it's also important to note in the sort of historiography of NAFTA, the only reason NAFTA got passed is because Clinton bought off a bunch of Democrats. And that's how it happened. I mean, I'm not saying that's a bad thing. Politics happens, right? But not an easy thing for Clinton to get through one bit.
Right.
Hi, I'm wondering what your analysis, how that would apply to the case, say, of Holmes-Burton, where the president at the time ceded quite a lot of authority to Congress in terms of freedom of presidential action, and what that might mean for the administration's policy for taking forward its opening of Cuba.
Can you repeat the question?
I'm just kind of wondering, you discuss how there's this balance of power between the president and Congress, and the areas where the president has more freedom for action, particularly in terms of sanctions and other areas. In the case of Helms-Burton legislation applying to Cuba, you had this quite unique case where the president seceded quite a lot of authority into legislation, which can only be now unwound with congressional votes. So how does your analysis apply to that case?
Well, again, I think Cuba is going to be a very interesting case for the president. I think a number of presidents have wanted to end the embargo, and as you rightly note, because of the giving up the kind of control, the president now is in a very sticky situation. But I think you have to look at that giving up the control in part because of kind of the domestic distributive politics and ideological politics around Cuba. That there is a very substantial group of Cubans in the United States who have opposed having any relationship and who have tried very hard to lobby to make sure that there isn't any kind of normalization of relations. And I think that's a reason for that act in the first place, which then takes away the kind of power of the president. In the larger sense, though, not just looking at Cuba, sanctions are a very strange area in terms of this presidential power because Congress can pass sanctions on its own. The president doesn't have to implement them, and the president can pass sanctions on its own, and Congress, it can go both ways. So this is an area where it's very confused about sort of who does what to whom and who has control over the area. And we see, and the Cuba case I think is going to be a very interesting case because you've got this kind of confusion about who has control. But it certainly is the case where domestic politics is again all around this, where you've got a number of the Republican contenders basically saying that they're going to undo whatever Obama, wants to do to normalize things with Cuba. So.
No, I think that's about right.
Who haven't we heard from? Sir?
Can you comment on what policy levers were pulled or not pulled in the context of the Iran nuclear deal?
The Iran nuclear deal, what kind of policy levers have been used?
Yeah, sanctions was a huge part of that. My understanding is that with appropriate Iranian behavior, that there will be substantial economic opportunities for the Iranian economy and becoming more integrated into the West. To the extent to which promises of aid were part of that, I'm not as clear on that. I'm not sure that
Release
was
of assets
release
and
of
trading sanctions.
yeah, release of assets that were already contested. So I'm not sure we want to call that aid, right? And so I think all of those things were a part of that. It was certainly something that I would actually say that the Iranian nuclear deal, as it was unfolding, as we're writing the book, we were kind of nervous about how that was going to turn out. To be honest, that was nervous from the perspective of are we getting the world right? In the end, Obama was able to largely put that in place, but to the extent to which there were to be economic consequences of this, and certainly there was a lot of ideological polarization about that. There still is. It's not going away. Getting it through, in some ways, was consistent with our theory that this is something that we thought the president had more control over. The extent of difficulty that the president had in getting it through was something I think that was more surprising for us in light of our argument. And so it's always good to leave something on the table that we were sort of wrong about, and I think that that's, I don't think we quite had the theoretical construct to completely nail that one. But it also opens up the, as Helen's pointing out, the study of the domestic politics of sanctions is understudied, and I think we want to learn a lot more about that.
There's some questions over here. Go ahead.
Thanks. So I'm just curious, sort of whether you're finding that the president has a much harder time pushing through sort of policy tools that are non-military, if that's independent of how the kinds of issues are framed. So, I mean, to take Tunisia as an example, one thing you mentioned, we can imagine, the president advocating for some kind of aid, development aid, and, he could say, on the one hand, this is just really important for promoting democracy, and that's something we care about. Or you could say, on the other hand, this is really important for stopping ISIS, and that's a primary security concern. So, like, would that sort of make a difference to how successful you'd be?
We sort of think that one indicator that we're right is the fact that when presidents want something, want to use a policy tool and they can't, they often go to the national security imagery, right? Because that suggests they think they can get things through that they otherwise couldn't get through without that imagery. And so, I mean, Dustin was just talking about the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And again, the president is having trouble with that because of the distributed politics around it in the United States. He's resorting, I think, to the national security imagery, not too much because he doesn't really want it directed against China, I don't think, but he's resorting to that because he's trying to push groups to vote with him on this and to give him some slack on it, because he knows that when he can successfully and credibly invoke the national security language, he can actually get more space for his policies. Now the problem is when he can credibly and successfully invoke that imagery, and American interest groups, the American public, and American legislators are not stupid. They will go for some things, but they're not going to go for everything. So you could go a little bit, you'll convince some of the people some of the time, but you're probably not going to convince all of the people all the time when you evoke this national security imagery. So I think there's some ability to frame things and move things forward, but I think in other areas, especially where interest groups are involved, they know what their interests are. That's why they're interest groups, and that's why they're organized, and that's why they spend money lobbying and giving campaign contributions, because they're not going to be fooled by these things.
Do you have a question as well?
Yeah, I was just wondering, you say that the president is not constrained by domestic politics with regards to the military, but do you think with the current situation in Syria, it seems like he's being quite reluctant to increase military intervention? Do you think that has anything to do with domestic politics?
So, my honest sense with that, I mean, a similar version of that question is, he drew that red line.
Repeat the gist of the question.
Oh, so the argument is that the president is less constrained on domestically on the deployment of military troops, but it seems like Obama has been very reluctant to deploy troops in Syria, etc. Another version of that question is he drew that big red line and then didn't do anything. Right? My personal view there is that he's getting some good advice from his more tactical type advisors, saying, look, sending a bunch of troops into Syria right now would be a quagmire. A quagmire in terms of we don't know where the enemy is, right? And that's the way they're framing. Today the defense secretary came out and said we'll be sending 500 special ops. It's much more for intelligence gathering, etc. So I think some of that reluctance is just a recognition of perhaps the military tool really wouldn't do a whole lot. That might change over time, right? As that intelligence starts to solidify and we understand whether putting people on the ground is a strategy versus sustained airstrikes, think that that is an example of showing that domestic backlash was really what led Obama to not do it. I just think that he got some good tactical advice that this probably wouldn't be a smart idea. Furthermore, I would say, especially with the red line, that's somewhere where the Russians stepped in, and we've essentially got an agreement to neutralize Assad's chemical weapons regime. Now, how effectively was that done? Are there canisters hidden somewhere? We might never know. But I think that was something where an international diplomatic arrangement was made to get chemical weapons out of that country, to the best we could, and that was seen as a win. That perhaps the pressure that Obama was able to put on by drawing that big red line was able to get.
Elizabeth, none of you docks my pay if I don't end on time. So I encourage you to stay though and chat with our panelists, buy their book, get it signed outside in the hallway,